Well met. This is episode 2 of my 4-part video essay series on what I think to be issues in contemporary Warcraft lore. If you want the full introduction, you can go watch the introduction section in episode 1. Link in the description. The main thing to note is that you will occasionally see bracketed numbers in the corner of the video, like this. These are citation numbers for when I make claims that I feel should be backed up with a source. You can find the citation in question in the description by the corresponding number. Also, if you'd prefer text to video, this series is also available in text format on my WordPress site, link also in the description. This episode concerns, as you probably read from the title, the World of Warcraft Chronicle series, and the development of its status as a lore Bible. At Blizzcon 2019's Q&A panel, it was stated that the Chronicle series of sourcebooks was written from the Titans' point of view, and the people who worked for the Titans. Subsequent mentions of the series have maintained this stance, although it appears the exact authorship, that is, the Titans themselves or people affiliated with them, seems to have fluctuated somewhat. Indeed, to my knowledge, every one of such later mentions have spoken as though this was the case all along, that the Chronicle was always meant to be read as the imperfect perspective of the Titans and their affiliates. Gentle viewer, that is not true. Before that fateful BlizzCon 2019 panel, the Chronicle had always been unambiguously described as a lore Bible series, intended to provide a codified, clear overview of the history and nature of the Warcraft universe. I will now go through a bunch of examples of this. If you already know all this stuff, or are just willing to take my word for it, you can skip to the timestamp indicated on the screen for the next section. In the July of 2015, in one of Blizzard's first promotional materials for the series, Chris Metzen described the book series as an attempt to codify and tighten up and clarify the history of Warcraft. He also described his fondness for how the Chronicle project takes a holistic audit of the Warcraft universe and how this really allows one to appreciate the origins and roots of things and events. The description of the video in question also describes the Chronicle series as a holistic look which defines the Warcraft universe. All of which would be very strange things to say of a book series intended to just be unreliable Titan propaganda. There's also the fact that Matt Burns, one of the authors of the first 3 volumes of the series, explicitly stated that the Chronicle is not written by any in-game character, specifically unlike the Diablo series Book of Cain, which otherwise serves a similar role as a sourcebook. He also said that the Chronicle sheds light on the lore. Personally, I would not describe an unreliable book written from an in-world character's point of view in those terms. The product description of the first book of the series, dating from shortly before its release in the March of 2016, describes it as a definitive tome of Warcraft history, stating that it reveals untold stories about the birth of the cosmos, the rise of ancient empires, and the forces that shaped the world of Azeroth and its people. There is nothing to suggest that the book's information is fallible, let alone written from a specific, limited, or even deceptive perspective. Amusingly enough, despite the retcon, the same description of the book on the official WoW website has remained unchanged. Please tolerate some sarcasm from me. Perhaps the game website too is written from the Titan's point of view. And rather tellingly, former principal narrative designer Steve Danuser who was the one who announced this retcon at Blizzcon 2019, himself, a year and a half earlier, had referred to the Chronicle series as written from an omniscient, dispassionate perspective, and explicitly not from a limited, in-character point of view. And all of that aside, there is also the fact that the actual texts of the books themselves, in my opinion, don't make sense as being written as Titan propaganda. To name a few examples, why would the Titans depict light and shadow as, quote, the most fundamental forces in existence, and have themselves and capital O order play second fiddle, even on their own cosmology chart? Why would the Titans, who current lore depicts as, much as other cosmic beings and their respective forces, being obsessed with their capital O order, sympathetically depict Azeroth's elementals as rejoicing in their primordial chaos? A chaos which the Titans themselves would clean up. Why would the Titans depict themselves and their creations as so fallible? Sargeras, the appointment of Odin as Prime Designate and the trouble that would follow, or the way the Titan Forged on Azeroth basically unraveled their own civilization. How would the Titans know about Ner'zhul's emotional life? Why would they, if they are as inflexible as recent lore would suggest, show in their series of propaganda books understanding and sympathy toward the primals of Draenor, who are avowedly against their vision of an ordered world? Why would they depict their supposed rivals in the capital L light as purely good? And so on. Once again, one could keep presenting similar arguments, but I believe the point has been made. Whatever the narrative team has decided for the series since, the Chronicle books were not originally written from the Titans' point of view. And this is not a matter of interpretation. Before I get to my arguments as to why I think this retcon is so undesirable, I first want to discuss a certain aspect that I think may have led to the retcon. Namely, it is my theory, though I do not have conclusive proof of it, that a crucial reason for the Chronicle retcon came about when the narrative team, in planning the future narrative development of Warcraft, decided to make the 6 cosmic forces equipotent, in constant struggle with each other, and, crucially, morally ambiguous. The Chronicle, of course, is in the way, so to say, of almost all of these, and it is my belief that the narrative team decided to discard it to add, as they saw it, more nuance to the Warcraft universe and its cosmology. How successful that was, if that was indeed a motivation of theirs, I will leave for now to the gentle viewer's own judgment. But the idea that the Chronicle presented worldview was lacking in nuance is, in my opinion, not true. The primalists of the Dragonflight expansion, I think, are a good example of this. Because I think they would have worked just as well, indeed, in my opinion, better, in a world where the Titans and the Titan Forged are straightforwardly a force for good, as shown in the Chronicle. As mentioned, the idea that the elemental chaos that ruled Azeroth before the Ordering was actually wonderful for the elementals themselves is already in the Chronicle. The Titans pacifying them and locking them up in the elemental planes, from the Titans' point of view, and the point of view of most mortals, was obviously a good thing. It enabled mortal life to exist and flourish on Azeroth, and let the planet be more than just an eternal elemental free-for-all. But from the elementals' point of view, a group of sapient planets came in, ruined their utopia, and then had the temerity to lock them up. Would some fire elemental be okay with having their paradise taken away just so a bunch of mortals could spring up and to satisfy Titan sensibilities? So even by sticking entirely to the Chronicle, the Primalist conflict could still, easily, have been a part of Dragonflight's story, and in my opinion, would have been just as meaningful and nuanced. And, one could perhaps argue, more fitting. I at least think that two opposing sides who are both right in their own way, as opposed to both being more or less in the wrong, not only has an interest all its own, but is also very Warcrafty. Say, for example, the Alliance and the Horde as the most prominent example of this dynamic. Or, for example, in Volume 2 of the Chronicle, the Anhari and Skalaxi, the two factions that ruled Apexis, that is, old-school Arakoan society back in the ancientness of Draenor. Apexis society believed in embracing both light and void, believing both to be natural parts of the universe. Which, as the cosmology section of Volume 1 actually teaches us, was correct. But in the end, it was the light-affiliated Anhari who became fanatical and treacherous, while the shadow-affiliated Skalaxi remained noble and devoted to their people. Clearly, the Chronicle well allowed for instances where light people could be bad and shadow people could be good. In the Chronicle order of things, even the most unambiguous duality of good and evil in Warcraft, light and shadow, had creative space for nuance and plurality. Or, from the same book, the example of the Evergrowth. The instances of capital L life in the Warcraft universe most familiar to players are uniformly positive ones. Druids, wild gods like Cenarius, night elves, the Emerald Dream. But here, in Volume 2 of the Chronicle, we see capital L life run amok, which, if left to its own devices, would eventually choke everything to death, even itself. Once again, the view of the cosmos as presented in the Chronicle allowed for nuance. Even something so positively familiar as life had the capacity to be outright ruinous. Then there's Umbric's Void Elves, who, despite being shadow-bound, certainly strike me as better sorts than someone like Zira. Or the suffering that uncontrolled arcane magic, the manifestation of usually good capital O order can bring about, as both Quel'Thalas and Suramar can attest. Or the way the capital D disorder Illidari have certainly been a more constructive force on Azeroth than the nominally light-worshipping Scarlet Crusade. You get the point. Again, I do not know if this concerns that the cosmos, as portrayed in the Chronicle, was too binary with no creative room for any nuance between these six powers, did play a big or any part in the decision to retcon the Chronicle. But if it did, I want to assure anyone watching this, particularly if I've lucked out and they're a member of the narrative team, that that is not the case. We already had an endlessly rich cosmos in the Chronicle. One with right and wrong, good and evil, of course. And also room for nuance. And indeed, I would argue, as per the presented examples, nuance not just despite this right and wrong, but also because of it. Episode 1 of this series already covers the topic of retcons, and why I think they are undesirable. So why have an episode dedicated to just one retcon? It is because I think that the discarding of the Chronicle series as a lore bible robs Warcraft of an invaluable lodestone for its canon, weakens the coherency of the Warcraft universe and severely reduces the ability of people outside of the narrative team to access the lore. That is to say, I think the topic warrants its own video because of just how impactful this specific retcon is. Indeed. And please note that I say the following without any disrespect meant to the narrative team or to people who like this retcon, and that I am not being hyperbolic for the sake of entertainment. I would go so far as to say that, in my opinion, it is perhaps the second worst creative decision made for the Warcraft universe since it got started in 1994. And if you want to know what I think the worst is, check out episode 4. To begin with, the Chronicle being a lodestone for the canon. As I argue in episode 1, a clear adhered to canon is not only desirable for Warcraft, but arguably outright vital. And the Chronicle represents, or represented, the framework of this canon. The nature of the cosmos and the grand and small strokes of its histories. Keeping to the Chronicle would have allowed creative development to remain within the bounds of canon without sacrificing, in my opinion, its freedom. And this, the Chronicle as a guiding light for the canon, is not just my personal interpretation, but something explicitly stated by people at Blizzard. For example, in an interview in the August of 2018 with the magazine Game Informer, it was explicitly stated that one of the Chronicle's intended purposes was to make canon less reactive and more solid. In the same interview, Sean Copeland, historian supervisor at Blizzard's creative development team, stated that one of the goals of the Chronicle was specifically, quote, to provide lore guidance and to enable people making creative decisions to make informed rulings that impacted the entire universe. Also in the same interview, my main man, Ian Hazzikostas, game director, even mentioned how, at the time, quote, most developers on the team have a copy of those books on their desks, end quote, for when a lore question came up, and how they only, quote again, bug their archivist in special cases, end quote. All of that being to say, the Chronicle as a lodestone for the canon is not just some personal dream of mine. It was, for several years, actual Blizzard World of Warcraft development team policy and practice. But the Chronicle retcon, of course, demolishes all this. Titan propaganda does not make for much of a lodestone for the lore. And it is my belief we have already seen the negative consequences of the removal of this framework. Refer to section 5 of episode 1 if you want more of my thoughts on that. But in brief, canon in contemporary Warcraft seems, to me, to be much looser and less meaningful, with the, in my opinion, inevitable consequence that the story and lore of Warcraft materially suffers. I wonder if most members of the development team still have copies of the Chronicle on their desks. Then there is the, as stated, coherency of the Warcraft universe. Another of the Chronicle series' stated purposes was to quote our boy Chris again, to codify and tighten up and clarify the history of Warcraft. He also said much the same in his preface to Volume 1 of the Chronicle, where he wrote, "This book, this Chronicle, is meant to bring it all together and reinforce the overarching narrative that lies at Warcraft's heart." Writing this was an opportunity to unite the frayed story ends and smooth out the rough edges of this fictional history. Indeed, 4.5 months after the announcement of the Chronicle retcon at Blizzcon 2019, Steve Denuser himself affirmed on Twitter that the Chronicle was written for the purpose of superseding older sources. And just to name one final example, in the aforementioned Game Informer interview, Sean Copeland also speaks to Chronicle's mission as a way of bringing together occasionally disparate and contradictory information, saying, "One of the goals we had while creating these books was to craft a truly cohesive and compelling guidebook that covers the history of the Warcraft universe from its origins to now. And as a story that's been evolving for decades, there's been a noticeable change or two in the narrative. Identifying those sources of potential misunderstanding was imperative for the project as it went along. And certainly there were some areas of uncertainty and contradiction. For some examples, what exactly is a Titan? And what is the difference between them and the creations? What is the relationship between the light and the shadow? How exactly are void creatures like void walkers different from demons? How did the likes of the Mantid fit into the history of the Troll-Akir Wars? How similar was exactly the Draenor of the Warlords of Draenor expansion to the main one? Were the Worgen born from some other horror dimension, as stated originally, or were they cursed night elves? Why the devil were there these old gods on Azeroth? Given that Frostmourne devours the souls of those it slays, how come, when Arthas killed Mal'Ganis with it, the Dreadlord evidently went through the normal demon rigmarole, and showed up later, instead of being imprisoned within Frostmourne? And so on. The Chronicle answered all of these, and many, many more. It's brought disparate, sometimes even contradictory, stories and portions of lore together in one unified, cohesive whole. The grand scope of Warcraft, all the myriad pieces making sense together without sacrificing their unique individual character. The diversity, which is one of Warcraft's greatest glories. Now, I don't want to overstate the impact of this. It's not like the Warcraft universe was in some discordant crisis before the Chronicle series. But even so, it was, in my opinion, very significant. And something we had not had before. Or something we have had since. With the discarding of the Chronicle, most all of those sources of incoherency and contradiction are restored. The frayed story ends, as Chris put it, that Chronicle mended, have been unravelled. I would say that we are back at the point Chronicle delivered us from, but I actually think we are worse. Much worse off now than we were even before it. With the narrative team's current willingness to declare previously canon sources unreliable, for more on that topic if you're interested, see episodes 1 and 3 of this series, not only does there not now exist any kind of unifying work for the Warcraft universe, now, engaging with disparate sources of lore, whether it's novels or in-game dialogue or developer statements or whatever else, you cannot be certain that that source will not be declared unreliable if it interferes with the narrative team's plans for story development. Some might argue that this is no different from how it has always been, but as I argue in episode 3, retconning a certain detail is much less disruptive than retconning the reliability of an entire source. Such uncertain foundations, I believe it is justified to say, actively work against narrative and thematic coherency. Now, by no means do I believe the narrative team has set out to weaken such coherency. Obviously not. But I do, unfortunately, believe that some of their practices have led to it all the same. Both of these aspects, a guide to the canon and coherency, also come together for this third point. The accessibility of canon and lore for people outside of the narrative team. With the Chronicle, if someone wanted to go and get an overview of Warcraft lore, the Chronicle was an easy recommend. A book series both comprehensive and with beautiful prose and art. And this was hardly just for newcomers. Anyone with an interest in the lore, no matter how versed, if they had a point they were unclear on or curious about, could consult the Chronicle and be assured that they got good info. But now, with the Chronicle declared untrustworthy, no such guidebook, as Sean Copeland put it in that interview, exists. Combined with the aforementioned practice of retroactively declaring lore sources as being unreliable, and the contradictions and disjointed sources that the Chronicle once fixed, there does not, at present, really exist a way to get completely reliable, comprehensive information on almost any subject, if one isn't on the narrative team or can consult a Blizzard historian like Sean. This, the inaccessibility of lore, is a topic also touched on in episode 3, but I think that the abolishing, so to say, of the Chronicle series, which had the stated purpose of being a clear, reliable, comprehensive source of lore, is a crucial element of this state of affairs. Regardless of one's thoughts on the Chronicle retcon specifically, I think most everyone can agree that people having difficulty, or even in places arguable impossibility in even knowing what the lore actually is a problem. So these are more objective reasons for why I think the Chronicle retcon is so harmful. But I think I would be somewhat amiss if I did not also share my more subjective reasons. Because I think that the Chronicle series is one of the most magnificent things to have come out of all the Warcraft universe. I think that it is beautifully, majestically, stirringly written. Some of the finest prose that has ever come out of Warcraft. It is gorgeously illustrated, capturing the scope and the heart of this universe of wonders. It is, in my opinion, excluding only WoW itself, the single greatest monument to and celebration of the fantasy universe so dear to all of us. The idea that it should be discarded and replaced with worthy but disparate book series of fallible perspective and limited scope is, to me, as said, perhaps the second worst creative decision ever made for Warcraft. So what would I change? As the gentle viewer may guess, restore the Chronicle to its status as a lore Bible. As I hope I have illustrated, the harmful effects of not doing so are material, and not restricted solely to the hardcore lore people, but, as I see it, adversely affect everyone with an interest in the story and lore of Warcraft. The narrative team might feel entirely justified, in my opinion, hesitation at the idea of undoing this retcon, though. They may feel that fitting the content of the Shadowlands expansion specifically to the Chronicle framework might not be elegantly doable. Personally, I think it is. I don't think there is anything there that couldn't be explained away reasonably. And in any case, despite how my commentary in this video may make the viewer think, I actually have great faith in the narrative team and have no doubt that they could and would find a way if they desired to. Refer to my feedback given at the feedback section of episode 1 for more of my thoughts on this sort of thing, but like I said there is also the fact that I don't think they should let a little inelegance get in the way of doing what is right for the Warcraft universe, if they agree that this is the right thing to do for the Warcraft universe. And of course, technically, it doesn't have to be the Chronicle specifically. Another series created for the same purposes could also work. But I mean, we already have the Chronicle, so I don't think creating a new Lore Bible series is the best course here. And at the barest least, I say that members of the narrative team need to stop talking about the Chronicle as though it was always written from a fallible point of view. There are almost no places where I feel that the narrative team of the last few years has utterly dropped the ball, but this is one example. Of course, deciding that the Chronicle is now written from the Titans' point of view is within their rights as people in charge of the Warcraft narrative. But to implicitly pretend that that is the way it was intended all along is so misleading as to be, frankly, deceptive. And here is where I'd switch to this episode's outro. Only, what by Merredin's beard is this? So, some background. I started planning these videos roughly a year ago, well before this was announced. I was not at all expecting any more volumes of the Chronicle. After all, what point would there be in publishing any more now that all of the series' purposes for existing had been demolished and the whole thing relegated to freaking Titan psyops or something? But here we are. I honestly don't know what this means. Is it going to be really explicitly Titan-originated now? The book description presently available mentions cosmology charts, plural. The one used through volumes 1 to 3 has since been, as stated, for example, in the Grimoire of the Shadowlands and implied in the New Uldaman dungeon, relegated to just another Titan perspective-only thing, and the Death one in the Grimoire implies all cosmic forces have their own similar one. But if the Chronicle is staying as just Titan propaganda, then perhaps it would present the Titan one only. Does this mean that the Chronicle is going back to an objective lore guide, and Blizzard has actually decided to do away with the Chronicle retcon? Are we in fact so back? I don't know. Maybe nothing has changed. For the better, at least. But with all the uncertainty, I still rejoice at the sight of a new volume of the series that, not so long ago, was a keystone of Warcraft lore. That is, as I said, to me at least, besides only WoW, the single greatest monument to and celebration of this universe so dear to all of us. And that is it for the Chronicle episode. In episode 3, we will be discussing the use of unreliable narrators in contemporary Warcraft storytelling. I hope to see you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Keep your feet on the ground.